All right, so we got a couple minutes after here, so we'll go ahead and get started. We'll hopefully everybody is excited about this. We got some great information for everybody today. We'll kick things off today. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. We're going to go over the new HITRUST version 11 with the CSF, the new CSF they just rolled out. Also, we're going to talk a little bit about the changes with the I1 and what that is going to mean to those who are looking at the I1 world. And then also we're going to cover the new rollout of the E1, the essentials assessment. So we have a lot of information that we want to cover today. So we have a question and answer Q&A portion of this that we're going to have at the end. So if you have any questions, you can post them in the comments, but most likely we won't address those until we get to the end of the presentation. Okay, so again, thanks today for joining. I'm Sean Dowling. I'm the Vice President and Head of the HITRUST Services here at Accorian. Joining me today is Andrea Britt. She's our Senior Director and Principal Consultant for the HITRUST practice here at Accorian. Stephanie Madhook is joining us as well. She's our Director of Compliance Services for our HITRUST team, and she also runs the discovery and remediation practice for us. So for many clients that come into us, she's one of the first individuals you'll be working with to make sure that you're ready to go and you're prepared for the validation. And then also joining us is Eric Rozier from HITRUST. He is the Director of Client Development at HITRUST, a plethora of experience. He's done many roles at HITRUST, and he's here today to talk with us about the version 11 and what it means for both the clients and the assessors. I'll take a couple seconds here. We'll talk a little bit about Accorian for those that aren't aware of who we are or what we do. We're a cybersecurity and compliance organization that's focused on supporting small and medium-sized organizations. Our goal here at Accorian is to provide solutions to client organizations that will allow them to stop compromising between technology and budgets. We know with small organizations, that's a huge challenge. Can I do this? What do I need to do? And oh yeah, by the way, can I really afford to do this? So we specialize working with organizations to understand what needs to be done, how they should do it. And we work with them on, what they can afford, what they can't afford, and then work out a roadmap with them on how to address these things moving on through their maturity through their cyber security program. We strive to be a full service technology partner. And our approach really is to combine a goal-oriented proven methodology that is focused on your fiscal and security needs. So again, we're not here just to push tools. We're not here just to get SOW signed for a specific work. We are looking long term with you and how we can build a partnership with our clients. Accorian provides compliance support services for HITRUST, SOC 2, ISO, NIST, and PCI. We're actually one of, I think, of only 9 organizations in the world that cover most or all of the primary standards out there for compliance. We do have our own attestation organization for our SOC 2s, which is Accorian Assurance. So not only can we do the SOC 2 certification processes in-house, we have our own accounting firm that handles the attestation portion of that as well. We provide security testing, which includes pen testing, red and blue teaming. We do black box testing. We'll do risk assessments. As much as we hate to admit it, we'll do policy and procedure writing and updating for organizations, as well as we do security compliance consulting and staff augmentation. So again, we're really trying to fill the gap with organizations to make sure that they have the appropriate tools, personnel, understanding, and knowledge of what they need to be successful in their cyber programs. We have developed our own compliance management and sustenance tool as well. We call that GoReco. That tool is for organizations. Once you go through a security framework standard, it's, what do you have to do to maintain that? It's a lot of work to get there. And organizations who've been, going through, say, the HITRUST process or some of the other, framework processes, there's so many things you have to do just to get to the baseline of that stuff. And then what happens after you finish all that? Well, then there's ongoing tasks and processes that have to be conducted throughout the year. So we have a tool that actually helps CISOs manage through that process, identifying based off of the control sets that are assigned to you what activities and tasks need to be done. You can manage that both with what you guys do in-house with your own teams and staff, and also work with outside vendors like us to handle things like testing and different types of documentation and things that are needed. Accorian really is, we're a global team. We have offices located in the U.S. Our headquarters is in East Brunswick, New Jersey. We have individuals that are spread out through the entire U.S. We have an office in Dubai, and we have 2 offices in India, one in Pune and one in Bangalore. So we really are a global provider. We have a client base that stretches around the globe as well, with clients pretty much on every continent at this point. And we'll talk a little bit more at the end. I'll go through some more details specifically about how we can support you guys with HITRUST, with the new things that we're going to talk about today, and then give you guys an opportunity to ask questions about all that. So we're going to start things off today. We're going to jump into the new version 11 of the CSF. Eric's going to take us through some of the key changes that are there, what HITRUST has incorporated into the new versions, a little bit about the roadmap process, because we do have some sunsetting with some of the older versions that are out there. So we have timelines that we have to make sure organizations are looking for there. And then also, what makes sense with you guys. So we'll talk a little bit, detailed as we get into the I1s and E1s. So Eric, you want to go ahead and take over at this point?
Great. Yes. Thank you, Sean. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. Great. Thanks. And nice to see everyone here. The first thing I want to start with is not knowing the depth of knowledge of the audience. Let me start first with about what HITRUST is. And HITRUST is an organization that champions initiatives that help organizations protect sensitive information. So there's really 2 dimensions of HITRUST. We are a standards body. We are a certifying body. So we provide a framework, and think of it as a framework of frameworks. So we incorporate NIST and ISO and HIPAA, many other authoritative sources, over 40, into the current framework that enable organizations to complete assessments against multiple authoritative sources to make it easier for them to provide assurances to their customers and to protect their sensitive data. So in 2017, we released version 9.0 of the framework. So it was the last time we had a major release of the CSF framework. We were, prior to v11 being released in January, we were at 9.6.1. So there'd been significant step change in the framework over that 5-year period. And this is by far probably the biggest leap that we've taken, really from 2 areas. One is the fact of trying to make it really easier for organizations to perform a HITRUST assessment. And I'll talk about that in a second. And then the whole nature of the cyber threat adaptive component that organizations are dealing with. Just if you subscribe to any news feed around cybersecurity or health sector IT, you see every day about breaches and ransomware and stuff. And so HITRUST has made a concerted effort to make the framework and the assessments that are part of it much more cyber threat adaptive. So what you see here is, and I think the assessor community and many of our customers would say maybe the most significant efficiency step that we've made in terms of where we have moved the evaluative elements. So if you think of the HITRUST framework, there are controls and requirements associated with those controls, and then the evaluative elements, which are really how you implement the control and how you test the control. And you can see here on the right-hand side, we have raised them a level and numbered them, as before they were all buried and embedded in a paragraph that the assessor firms and the organizations really had to try and unravel on their own. and it was complicated and confusing. So we felt like this step would make it a lot easier and a lot more transparent and a lot faster for organizations to look at what are the evaluative elements that are required relative to, if it's an R2, for example, the policy, the procedure, the implementation, and maybe measured and managed components of the control and requirement. So that's really kind of the first big step that we've taken. So we've raised them up to where they're actually visible at the control requirement level. They're not buried down in the subtext, and we've actually identified them by numbers so that they're much more traceable throughout the actual framework. So Sean, thank you. So if you think about our assessment portfolio, and R2 is the risk-based 2-year assessment. It is a 2-year certification. In the interim year, you're required to do, or in the middle year, you're required to do what we call an interim assessment, which is the organization needs to address their caps and any gaps that they might have had, and as well as a random number of controls, just to make sure that the certification and the assessment is still accurate and reporting against the true scope of the environment, and nothing significant has changed. For the R2 assessments, while they are becoming more threat adaptive, that means with the release of v11, we will be sunsetting the 9.1 and 9.4 versions of the framework. But that will not happen until September 30th. So if you this year, and I mean, in terms of your ability to create, so if you've already started an assessment that on a 9.1 through 9.4, then as long as you've spun up the object, you've started the assessment, you have through September to start that assessment. Then you have until all the way until December of 2024 to actually submit that. So from a sunsetting standpoint, we've given organizations a lot of time to work through that. We realize, depending on the starting point of an organization, an R2 journey may take 18 months. At best, it might take 6 months if it's a very mature organization, not a lot of remediation. So we've given the flexibility there. And then not until 2026 will the libraries for 9.1 and 9.4 be removed. 9.5 and 9.6 will stay in there. We don't yet have a sunset date finalized for those either. In terms of the I1 assessment, and I'll talk more about this in a second, there's been a lot of, I think, great improvements. I1 was released last year in first quarter. Had a lot of learnings from that, from both our assessor partners like Accorian, in terms of going through that first cycle and understanding it. We had a lot of changes that we're making to it. One is, of course, and I'll talk about later, is the threat adaptive nature of it is continuing to improve on that, as well as the number of controls. But what's really important here is if you are currently in a 9.6.2 version of an I1 assessment, that assessment has to be created by the end of April, okay, and has to be submitted no later than July of this year. So if you're in the middle of that and you have other questions, I encourage you to reach out to your representatives at Accorian. You can always reach me through info@HITRUSTalliance.net or your customer success manager on the HITRUST side. We're working with a lot of organizations as they're trying to navigate that sunsetting timeline. So thanks, Sean. Okay. So the next thing we're going to do is take a look at what the version 11, how it has impacted our, what we're now calling our assessment portfolio. The challenge that organizations have had in the past as they've wanted to pursue or have been required to pursue a HITRUST certification is the amount of time it takes to go through getting an R2 or even an I1 that your customer, or what we call your relying party, may not have visibility to progress you're making for some time. So there's two things that really happened with the release of v11. There is the creation of what we call this E1 Essentials assessment, which is 44 controls. It is built around mostly cybersecurity controls, the fundamentals that an organization needs to be performing at a minimum to connect to your services or to provide services to you and reduce the inherent risk that that vendor may provide to you or that you may provide to an organization as assessed entity. But it enables an organization to get started on HITRUST, show visibility to their customers that they're making progress, and with it only being 44 controls and only built around the implementation of the control, it's a much easier, much more affordable beginning path for organizations to go through a HITRUST certification. It does come with a 1-year certification. So the E stands for Essentials, the 44 essential controls. The 1 year is for a 1-year certification. So at the end of 1 year, you would recertify against the 44 controls. Some of them may be different as we make it threat adaptive and adjust some of the controls to the current threat environment. And then I think the big news here is that if you see how it's designed, the assessments are nested within each other. So if your in journey looks like an R2 or is targeted to be an R2, any of the work you're doing on an E1 and then to an I1 and to an R2 are traversable. So we're not going to be, you're not going to have to go and redo work. So if you've addressed controls, you've done the work in the past, other than the testing you may need to, you won't have to go through that whole rigorous process again. So it helps organizations move faster, makes it a little bit more efficient, and then now also addresses organizations with different levels of budgets, but also want to provide higher levels of assurance for their organization or for their customers. Okay. The I1 has, and that's fine. The I1 is now, last year was 219 controls. It is now down to 187 controls. And again, some of those controls have been modified to be more threat adaptive nature of the market. We actually are in partnership with Forescout, who provides us threat feeds. We map that to the MITRE framework, threat framework, and then we map that to the actual controls in the CSF to make sure that each of these assessments are covering the highest risk threats that are presented to the market right now. So as I mentioned on the previous page, the creation of the E1 and now the new I1 enables an organization to, if they present very low or smaller inherent risk to their customer, they have a path through an E1 to get started on the journey to an E1 certification. So it is a HITRUST certification. The I1 also the same way. And just so you know, both the E1 and I1 go through the same rigor that the R2 assessment, meaning the assessor provides the third-party attestation and validation work. It then goes through our assurance team that does all of the audit and quality checks prior to a certification or a validated report being issued. So it has the same rigor, which enables an organization to provide the same level of transparency, consistency, and accuracy that you get from the R2 certification in the past. Okay. And keep going. At this point, I'll turn it over to Andrea, because there is a little bit of different component to the E1 and I1 scoring. It's still based on the PRISMA methodology that we use for the R2. And I'll turn it over to you, Andrea. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. So as Eric mentioned, the scoring is just a little bit different with the new I1 assessment and the even newer E1 assessment, which actually makes the process of validation testing a little bit more streamlined. So both of these assessment types are implementation focused, which means the only maturity level that's of the 5 maturity levels within HITRUST, which is policy, procedure, implementation, measured, and managed. In an E1 and an I1 assessment, the only maturity level that will be scored is the implementation level. However, I can tell you that many of the evaluative elements that Eric discussed earlier under implementation include the need for an organization to have documented policies and procedures, which makes sense because policies and procedures are that foundational component to building a robust security program. So even though they will not be scored as they would traditionally in an R2 assessment, meaning looking for both strength and coverage requirements, they become part of the implementation evidence for an E1 or an I. So something to keep in mind here, if your goal, as Eric had mentioned, would be to ultimately go through and receive an R2 certification, but you're starting with an E1 or even possibly starting with an I1 assessment in your HITRUST journey, you want to make sure that you're meeting, when you're looking at your policy procedure documents, you want to make sure that you're meeting those strength and coverage requirements at the beginning, because that's going to do 2 things. Even though you're going through an E1 or an I1, that it's only going to score your policies and procedures under implementation. If you are looking at them from that R2 perspective for strength and coverage, it's going to do 2 things. It's going to create an easier lift for you when you do move to that R2 assessment. And then most importantly, your organization is going to have that documented foundation to an effective security program. So let's talk about another nice update to the I1 assessment under version 11. So we know that an R2 certified report, as Eric mentioned, is good for 2 years, with the interim assessment, which is an abbreviated assessment, being conducted in that middle year. The I1 assessment is conducted annually, so the certification is only good for 1 year. So a nice update, as you can see by this slide using version 11 of the I1, is the introduction of this rapid recertification. So the full I1 is then conducted at year 1 with an opportunity to do a rapid recertification, which is an abbreviated assessment at year 2, and then another full assessment at year 3, and so on. So this is similar to the interim assessment for an R2, but not entirely the same. The criteria must be met is a bit different for a rapid recert, and it all has to do with being able to show that the assessed environment has not materially degraded since the original I1 assessment. So I'm not going to go into details. There's a lot of different components of being able to determine that. And if you'd like to hear a little bit more about how that works, please reach out and we'd be happy to discuss it with you. All right, so I'm going to hand it over to Stephanie, who's going to talk a little bit about the HITRUST journey.
All right. Regardless of whether you're targeting an E1, an I1, or an R2 assessment, these are the basic phases that Accorian follows in helping you achieve those levels of certification. We also, we also know there are organizations out there that might be unsure whether or not they're prepared to move directly into assessment and may need help with framework adoption and in establishing their information security management program. Or you might be wondering how to move to higher levels of assurance. Regardless of your starting point and wherever your journey is taking you, these are the steps that we're going to follow in learning about your organization and helping move you towards certification. And we're going to talk about these in a little bit more detail. So if we can go to the next slide. So my area of expertise is with discovery, and you'll notice that we call this discovery as opposed to readiness or gap assessment or pre-assessment, among some other terms that are kind of used for this phase. And, in keeping with the spirit of discovery, this phase is aimed at learning about our clients, about your goals, objectives, your organization, the systems that manage sensitive information, and the types of assessments that you're considering undertaking. One of the first steps that we'll take in is to scope the system to be assessed. And so unlike other assessments, HITRUST only certifies a system and not an organization. So this step is really critical to discovering where sensitive information is located and understanding the boundaries of the system. Some organizations may not know which systems to include in the scope of assessment when we're having those discussions, or may have complex operating environments, which makes scoping more challenging. Accorian is ready to help facilitate those discussions and arrive at a reasonable approach to your HITRUST journey. For organizations on a longer HITRUST journey, we'll help align your assessment strategy to meet the organization's goals and objectives. During the scoping sessions, scope details are entered into my CSF along with scoping factors, which help identify applicable requirements from the Common Security Framework. For organizations that are considering that longer, more strategic approach, we may scope a second assessment object, which would be used to understand requirements that might be applicable to achieve higher levels of assurance in the event of growth with products and services that would present greater inherent risk, or would address substantive changes to products or operations. The next step would be to gather information about the organization's current state policies and procedures and implementation. Policies and procedures are sampled to determine whether or not they align with HITRUST strength and coverage requirements, like we were discussing before, or whether they need to be modified. And interviews are conducted with subject matter experts to determine current state implementation, as well as shared responsibility with service providers. The outcome of this process is a gap assessment and a roadmap to readiness toward a HITRUST assessment. And depending on your starting point and your strategic goals, the outcome might also include a plan to step into CSF adoption or increasingly higher levels of assurance. All of our plans are going to include remediation recommendations. And so based on your gap assessment, the information we gathered during discovery, the next step would be for your organization and assessed entity to take the remediation recommendations and make a plan to undertake remediation. During that remediation process, Accorian is going to follow your progress, providing advice and guidance about readiness for an impending assessment. Let's go to the next slide. And here, depending on your remediation effort and when remediation tasks are complete, the incubation phase begins. And I'll hand it off to Andrea to talk about incubation.
Thanks, Steph. So after discovery and remediation that Stephanie talked about, comes the HITRUST required incubation period. So incubation sometimes is called steady state, and it is still required even if you're conducting an E1 or an I1 assessment. So as you can see on the left side of this slide, if a policy or a procedure document changes during that remediation period, it must sit in that incubation or steady state for 60 days before we, your external assessor, has the ability to test it. So for an E1 or an I1, even though they're not formally scored as they would be for an R2, obviously this becomes your implementation evidence. So one thing to remember about policy and procedure changes is that for it to be considered a new policy document or a procedure document where you've made a change to a control, how you've implemented that control, for it to be considered implemented and ready to go into discovery is that it's been reviewed and approved by management and disseminated to the workforce. So that's a pretty critical step. You can't just update your documents and say, we're ready to start incubation. You've got to have that full implementation process. So if you've implemented a new process, you document it in your new procedure document, and then the implementation of that new process showing how it meets the control has been completed. That type of a change needs to be in place for a full 90 days before that process can be tested. So in other words, 90 days worth of evidence is needed that you would provide to your external assessor, to Accorian, must be available for us to be able to test that control. So about halfway through a 90-day incubation process, we actually, the assessment lead of the project begins working with the client, transitioning from the discovery team to the assessment team, validation team, to begin what we call validation prep. So this includes events like discussing population files, putting those population files together, selecting samples from those population files for testing, and then talking about the best way that you can present implemented evidence to make sure it's understandable not only for your external assessor, Accorian, but also ultimately that evidence is easily understandable for HITRUST. So evidence collection for controls that are not affected, were not affected by any remediation, can also be started to be gathered here. And then policy and procedures could be provided for review, and for an R2, it would be for scoring. And then after incubation is over, after that either 60-day or most likely 90-day incubation period, all other evidence is gathered for those controls that were under remediation, and you provide all that information to Accorian for testing. So then we move into validation testing. We take that evidence, we validate that the organization is performing the control in the way that your policy and your procedures say that you are performing it. So keep in mind here that the validation team cannot offer any advisory services at this point. They are the auditors. But what we do is we could certainly ask for any additional evidence. So if you've missed a sample, providing evidence for a particular sample, or if you need to provide us additional evidence that might help us understand how you've satisfied a particular control, we could ask for it. We just can't tell you how to do it at that point. So then after all the testing is performed, we perform an internal QA, an Accorian QA. We make sure that all our T's are crossed and our I's are dotted. And then we generate any potential corrective action plans or CAPs that would need to be addressed by the assessed entity. And that would be if there were any downscoring from those maturity levels that created the need for corrective action. Those would be evident at that point and be addressed by the client and documented within the MyCSF tool. And then we would submit to HITRUST. So that's our validation phase details. I'm going to hand it over to Sean to wrap things up.
Sure, thanks. Good information, guys. I think there's a lot more to this than what we can cover here just in the webinar. And a lot of this is very detailed or prescripted to your organization, and the specific settings or specific environment that you guys have, the applications, what you guys are doing in your security program. We can answer a lot of general questions about, here's what the framework is, here's dates, here's what you should look at. But a lot of this is going to really depend on specific information that we would have to collect from you guys. So as we get ready to go into the question and answer portion of the webinar, I'll give you guys a few minutes to kind of formulate some of your questions. Please go ahead and post those in the chat and send those over. The thing I want to run through right now, just really quick, following up with what everybody said here, we talked about the new version 11, the changes that are involved in that, and for those who have done HITRUST before, I think you can definitely see there's a significant change in the approach that needs to be implemented for going forward with your next assessment. For organizations that are new to this, obviously we need to have conversations about where do you start in this process. What do you need immediately from this? Do we have time to help you work and build your program? Do we have to, answer a specific need from a vendor or a client or something like that, over a period of time? So again, a lot of this is going to, really depend on, where you guys are. But the bigger, question that I want to throw, or answers I want to put out there for questions that come in for us specifically, is how can, Accorian help you guys? So a lot of this really is around, our experience, our relationship with HITRUST. We've done well over 300 validated assessments between the senior leadership of our organization. We've staffed significantly over the last 4 years to grow to be one of the top assessor firms in the world with HITRUST. And obviously, as I said before, we throw out a whole bunch of other frameworks that we work on. So we're looking at a much larger picture than just, getting you guys through a validated assessment with HITRUST. We're looking at your overall security stance, where you may fit with other frameworks. And obviously, the big question is, are you secure? And then we take and overlay that with, what do you have from a resource capability for managing this, budgets, all those other factors that we have to take into consideration with all this. What we've done really is, since Accorian is really geared towards working with small to medium-sized organizations, we've built a methodology that we think works very well. Stephanie and Andrea, kind of walk through some of this process with you, but a lot of this is really just trying to figure out, where you guys fit on the food chain when it comes to your cyber, security program. And, what do you have to do to become compliant with whatever standard we're looking at here? So we really, want to work with your organization with our methodology, dig in deep in the beginning, figure out, what do you have? What do you do that that you do well? What do you do that you don't do well? What don't you do that you have to do? So that's a little bit of that beginning piece. And then there's, this whole remediation side of it, where, we're not the guys that are going to come, we're not going to sell you tools. We're not going to, be the engineers that are going to come in and configure stuff for you, but we're going to work with you guys on identifying what those tools and configuration settings need to be, one, to meet baseline security standards, but then also to achieve whatever, a requirement within one of the frameworks, states you have to have. But our, claim to fame is really trying to find the holes with you guys, helping you guys remediate that to get to the point where we can implement, or adopt, these frameworks like HITRUST, and then getting you through the validated process. So I really want to make sure that, it's very clear, and, this is not a one and done type approach, from an Accorian perspective. It's a long relationship. We talk about it all the time in our sales calls. We joke about, this, we're looking to, build a long-term relationship. I don't want the SOW just to do your validated assessment and say, hey, great, you passed, or sorry, you didn't make it. We want to build you into a successful program that gets you the certifications you need, but then also build that 3, 5, 7, 10-year relationship with you guys. Because unfortunately, this never really goes away. Once you start the journey, it really never stops. So we just want to make sure that, you have a strong, reliable partner that's looking at what needs to be done today, but then also is looking down the road for, what you guys need to be successful and to maintain your programs, and then ultimately improve them as well. So as we step into the question and answer portion of this here, we will provide the slides out for this deck, also the recording for this here as well. So we're going to open up the floor for questions. Again, please post those in the Q&A. We do have a couple of questions that have already come in. I think one of them really is, and I'll start with Eric on this here, because this, I think, is really driven towards some of the marketing side of the E1. Is the E1 or even the I1 a replacement for a SOC 2 Type 2?
It's a very good question. I believe that it is comparable. We believe and maybe a step forward. And of course, it depends on the organization. Because it's a founded off of the CSF, it goes through the level of rigor, like with your organization and inside the organization, the control, it's a set base of controls, not selected by the individual organization. And in some cases, they may select the ones that they know they're going to perform well on. And it also goes through the additional validation, similar to the R2 and I1, where it goes through our assurance team and our QA team to have that third set of eyes per se, as well as the AI engine that we have built in our assurance program to look at and find potential issues. It's just a higher level of quality, we believe, and of course that's HITRUST. And because we felt like this segment that the E1 services needs kind of the next generation of assessment, and so we feel that it's kind of in the same space. And again, it becomes an organization's preference and some degree what their customers are requesting of them. And so certainly from a HITRUST, we like it a lot, and would love to see more people using it as we expand our API ecosystem off of the MyCSF platform. Organizations will be able to ingest the assessment results directly into their GRCs. That's something that we're starting to release in the next few months. So with that, they'll have organizations will be able to share your assessment results with your customer digitally, as opposed to having maybe send them a full 500-page report. So we're trying to make this whole third party and reporting and sharing of results a lot easier, a lot more secure than it hasn't been in the past. And I think the E1 is a step for organizations to be able to do that. Plus, it enables an organization who's maybe been performing ISO or other assessments to start on the HITRUST journey, where they've never really been able to do that. From the, to start an R2 is a long, arduous journey, and we realize that. So hopefully that answers your question.
Okay, great. We'll flip it around a little bit here. For an organization that has already gone through an R2 assessment, can they subsequently opt to do an I1 or an E1? So essentially step backwards.
Yeah. It's interesting. We've been getting that question quite often. And again, it depends. I think the first thing, if the organization needs to ask themselves and their customers, if they're under a requirement or a preference from one of their customers for an R2, but they don't believe that there's the level of risk they're presenting is an R2 level, then I think they need to make that case to the organization, their customer, that they would like to pivot, because they are not the same. R2 is a risk-based assessment, which is tailored specific to the scope and the risk that a vendor maybe presents or an entity presents to their customer. So they're very different things. There's a HIPAA component as well if you're using HITRUST for HIPAA, but it's a good conversation to have. And I know firsthand there are organizations that are starting down that path. Not many, but I've had a few conversations where they say, yeah, when we look at the level of threat or risk this organization presents to us, an R1 or an R2 may be too much. So we are seeing them do that evaluation right now.
Yeah. And I think because we have another question that came in, I think it kind of relates to this too, is do we know if companies will accept the E1 or the I1? And I also think that that's part of the previous question is, if you're going to step back, you need to make sure that that the E1 or the I1 is acceptable for whatever purposes you've been using HITRUST for.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you don't want to get in that environment if you shift or pivot back to an I1, and then the next year when you present, or they're asking you for update on your assurance and remediation, that you present a different assessment to them, might create questions. But yeah, definitely have the conversation. I just want to say that to the individuals on the call, don't hesitate to reach out to Accorian, right? Don't hesitate to reach out to HITRUST. Again, if you submit an email to info@HITRUST.alliance.net, maybe mention my name, I'm happy to get on the phone. If you've got a customer who's not accepting it or continues to make you fill out additional questionnaires, we're certainly, we have the resources and want to support the adoption and acceptance of HITRUST. We have an initiative has formed across healthcare primarily. It's called the Health 3PT Initiative. I'm actually kind of doing some of the legwork in the background for them. But we have 47 healthcare organizations, and these are primarily payer type organizations or provider covered entity type organizations that are providing services directly to patients and for patient care. They've come together under this initiative to try and get broader adoption and standards. So if it's a R2 assessment that you've completed, you ought to be able to deliver it, assuming the scope is consistent and the same, you ought to be able to use it at multiple customers without having to fill out every survey in addition. And that's one of the things we're really trying to help organizations do, is get rid of the redundant, inefficient waste within this supply chain risk.
Yeah. Okay. Couple more questions. Love
Sure.
the fact that everybody's responding. I think we
Yeah.
kind of piqued interest here. So one of them, and we can probably do some research. We don't know the answer on this, but it says that I noticed the Cloud Security Alliance, the CSA, CCM controls are no longer mapped to the HITRUST controls. And do we know the reason for this?
Yeah, I'm going to have to get back to you on that.
Yeah.
I saw that question. I pinged my standards team. That's the first I've heard that. I'll have to get back to you, Sean, on that, and I'll let you communicate that back out to.
Steph, I don't know if you've seen it. I know Stephanie did a huge deep dive into a lot of the new controls and the way this is, the framework is mapped.
Okay.
So I don't know if this rings any bells to you.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I had not noticed that, but that's a very good question. I'll be interested to find out the answer.
All right, Eric, we'll get us the answer and we'll let the world know.
Sure. Working on it already.
All right, a couple more here. R2's now threat adaptive. What's the frequency of the updates? I think annual is going to be the minimal, and I think based off of risk is what we've been told. Yeah,
and I think if you think about it, 9.0 was released in, I believe, September of 2017. We're now on 9.6.2. I think you'll see the dot releases and the dot releases as this adjusts. It's still up to the organization if they're in the middle of an R2 and they're using 11.0. There's no, it's up to them. I mean, they can always, with their assessor or within the MyCSF platform, spin up another assessment to compare how much more work would this be, or maybe less work if I move up to the next version without losing all the work that they've already done. That's still an organizational decision. I think you're going to continue to see the cloud service providers be very aggressive, move more towards annual. So they want to kind of be the leaders and remain current and kind of in front of things. So I think it's really would be an organizational decision to make. And again, the HITRUST resources are there. Reach out to your success manager or contact HITRUST, and happy to help you work through that decision.
Yeah, I think one of the things we've seen, especially with the I1 changes coming out this year, there's a huge timing factor that needs to be taken into consideration, especially if you're in the I1 world, because with the fact that we can anticipate at least an annual update, and probably what we're seeing now is a rotation of, hey, you have to have this object created by this date, it's got to be submitted by this date. I think that's something, as assessor firms across the board, we need to look at, but clients need to understand, if you show up, in December or January and you're trying to, you're trying to really push through an I1, there's a really good chance we're probably going to have to make a shift sometime in Q1, Q2 to the newer version, just
Yeah.
because of the timing and where you are with your remediation efforts.
Yeah, yeah. And it's interesting you bring that up, because I was on a call earlier this morning with our internal team looking at how do we help the customers get in front of this. So if there is a customer that has already started on a 9.6.2 I1, we're proactively contacting them to help make sure they're aware and they're navigating that appropriately. And in some cases, if we have to maybe accommodate some things, we're certainly happy to listen and help make the case for you.
Okay.
Okay.
So I think there's just looking through the question list here. We've got a few minutes left here. One of them, which this is actually from one of our staff members. It's interesting. How does HITRUST guarantee security from zero-day attacks? Yeah, Eric, how do you guys guarantee that?
I'd love to say that we guarantee something here, but I can't. I guess the way I would answer that is that within the framework and the integration of all of the NIST and NIST CSF and ISO, and even to some degree HIPAA, we have the 19 domains. We have domains specifically focused on incident response, business continuity, disaster recovery. So our role is simply making the controls visible that need to be implemented and making sure that there is policy, procedure, and plan in place to monitor those controls and make sure that that they are protected. I know that zero is a very hot item. We also have a long list of what we kind of call partner organizations that are very excited about providing services to organizations that support the implementation and monitoring of a control, and that are around 0 days. And so look for more of that probably in the next year as strategically HITRUST looks at how do we migrate more to continuous monitoring, ongoing assessments, those type of resources that organizations really need to have in this day and time we live in.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Last one here from Navesh. What is the total number of control categories and control objectives in the latest CSF? And I think this is kind of subjective based off what you're looking at.
Yeah, for sure. Again, it depends on, if you look at the whole CSF, it's just a number. I believe it's about 2,180 is the last number I heard. But again, that depends. An E1 is going to be 44 requirements. That an I1 is going to be 187. An R2, I see R2s that kind of at the lowest level are 250, all the way up to 900. If you're including HIPAA privacy, HIPAA breach, and you're doing a comprehensive privacy and security assessment. So and also based on the number of records and access points and such that an organization has. So on average, I believe an R2 size right now is around 350 requirements.
Yeah, that's about what we're seeing. It's about 350 on average with a baseline, R2. And again, you like you said, there's so many different things in there. It's 190 plus new controls when you go over 10 million records. You add privacy. If you're a covered entity, it's a whole different world.
Right.
Then you throw in all the regulatory factors. I think on the most part, though, I think on average, like HIEs, we see on the higher ends with the 900,000s because of just the higher regulatory constraints that they have. But on average, I think the smaller organizations were in that 350 range. And we try, and again, we as an assessor firm, I know most of the assessor firms do this. We go through scoping sessions with the organization, probably multiple times, really, but just kind of learning about the organization. What are we actually putting into the assessment as part of that scope, application wise, environmental wise, locations, all that stuff feeds into your number of controls and then what you guys are actually doing. So when we say this is subjective, it's truly subjective to your organization.
Yeah. And we did before, or as we were developing V11, our concern was we didn't feel the need to expand the requirements in an R2, for example. We felt like the coverage based on the tailoring factors were good. And so once we completed V11, we went back and ran a comparison of an R2 and V11 versus each version all the way back to 9.0, and found out that on average across thousands and thousands of assessments, it was actually a decrease in the number of requirements. I believe it was about 5% decrease on an R2 versus the 9 frameworks. So it's not, if you've heard, or if you're thinking, oh my gosh, it's going to add a lot, it's actually going the other way, right? It's pretty consistent, or maybe a little bit fewer than in the past. And again, that depends on which authoritative sources and the type of assessment you're scoping.
You're looking at, yeah.
And
also remember too, because it is a threat adaptive model at this point here, there are new controls added to that. So even we've done that comparison as well, where we've taken and looked at previous versions. We've seen a decrease in the core base control count, but then there's an increase because there's obviously new controls that are being added on a relatively frequent basis, based off of what's going on in the world. So great.
Sure.
All right, guys, I want to wrap us up. I want to take a moment, thank Eric. This has been, just, I think, incredible information for everybody. Thank you for taking your time with us today to cover all this. And, I want to thank, Stephanie and Andrea for their portions. We do these webinars at least monthly. We try to cover something going on in the compliance world. A lot of these are around HITRUST specifically. We are, doing coming up in May, for those of you that are in India. Accorian will be doing a CEP event, a community extension event with HITRUST in Bangalore and Pune. That'll be May 15th and May 16th and May 18th. I will be there to present with that there. So anybody that's in India who wants more information about adopting HITRUST and where you need to start, we'll be there to walk you guys through that. And as always, please, as Eric has said, a couple times through this presentation, I've said it a couple times, reach out to us. Everything that is going on in your security program, you need to have somebody you can bounce questions off of. It's complicated. The rules are only getting more stringent. The world is getting crazier with what they're people are able to do against your organization and your networks, and even with the cloud side, I mean, we're seeing a lot of concerns and things like that. There, just because we're in the cloud doesn't mean you're safe. So again, reach out to us, let us know if there's anything we can do to help you guys. And again, thanks everybody for attending. And we will follow up once the recording is complete. We'll send out the recording to this, we'll send out the slides. But if you have any specific questions, please reach out to us. Thank you guys and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.